President Trump's maximum pressure strategy against Ukraine seems to be achieving its first victory, the complete collapse of the Ukrainian front in Kursk. This is, of course, a valuable gift to Vladimir Putin. One more. And I'm sorry to say it, but the news coming from Ukraine is not good. In the last few days, the Russian army, supported by North Korean troops, has carried out a major offensive in Kursk that seems to be succeeding. The situation is such that the incursion of Ukrainian troops on Russian soil seems to be nearing its end. And why do I say that Trump has a lot to do with this? Well, because, as all of you may already know, it's been about a week since Trump cut off all assistance to Ukraine. We're talking about absolutely vital military supplies for Zelensky's troops, supplies such as 155mm ammunition, something that they have now been forced to ration even more, which has made it unfeasible to use the ammunition that would have been necessary to stop the Russian North Korean offensive. Of course, this goes a lot further than howitzers and military support. We're also talking about access to intelligence, information, monitoring data of Russian operations, and even access to satellite imagery. The point is that by halting all this, Trump has left the Ukrainian troops in Kursk half-blind and lame, something that Moscow naturally moved to take advantage of. And how did they do that? By pulling out all the stops and launching an intense offensive, something that the President of the United States himself acknowledges. But do you know what? Instead of me telling you, let's hear it from the man himself.
Mr. President, think that Vladimir Putin is taking advantage of the U.S. pause right now on intelligence and military aid to Ukraine?
No, I actually think he's doing what anybody else would do.
Donald Trump is looking for a quick peace deal, and the easiest way to achieve it is to get the weaker or dependent party to give in, cave in, and accept all the conditions. After that, it isn't clear that this peace has anything to do with justice, nor that it's even advisable in international politics. That it is the only possible way. Well, that is unlikely. But no matter, it's the easiest way to reach a peace agreement. And let me stress again, don't take my word for it. Let's get Trump to tell us.
I don't know that they want to settle. If they don't want to settle, we're out of there because we want them to settle. And I'm doing it to stop death.
VisualPolitik community, right now, I'd like to be telling a very different story. But at VisualPolitik, we have a duty to the truth. The loss of the Kursk front is a major blow to Ukraine, one more that it has received in recent days. And keep in mind, it isn't because it's particularly strategic for the war, or because it will mean the collapse of its lines, but due to the fact that it's a major blow in political terms. Kursk was one of the most important bargaining chips Ukraine held on its side, and now it may have lost it. But make no mistake, this has not come without a price for the Russians. Far from it. The Kursk raid that the Ukrainians launched in the early hours of the morning, and by surprise on the 6th of August 2024, forced the Kremlin to make a gigantic effort. An effort that forced them to reduce the pressure on other points of the front within Ukraine itself. For Putin, the first invasion of Russia since World War II was a real embarrassment to his position of control and power. Let's just say that the Kursk offensive exposed his own weaknesses, while giving the Ukrainians a powerful bargaining chip. So to prevent this incursion from going further, and at the same time to try to recover as much land as possible, Putin began to divert resources massively from other fronts that were practically frozen, and if not frozen, then much more stagnant. So basically, since last summer, the hottest focus by far has been this land entry into Russia, where the Ukrainians cleverly occupied positions with greater ease of defending themselves. The result? The Russians have had to concentrate a lot of troops there, most of their drone strikes, a significant artillery capability, a lot of air support, and some 12,000 North Korean troops. And let's see, from that point of view, part of the objectives of the Kursk raid have been fulfilled. In Kyiv, they have managed to give other fronts some rest, but not only that.
It's true, we can't stop them. They just sweep over us, advancing in groups of 50 North Koreans while we have only 6 men in our positions.
The Russians have advanced intensively, yes, but this has meant that they've had to sustain more than considerable losses. To be clear, Kursk has been one of the fronts with the best casualty ratio in favor of the Ukrainians. Let's just say that for every casualty that Ukraine has suffered, it's estimated that here the Russians and North Koreans have suffered at least 3. And according to Western intelligence, we could be talking about more than 4,000 Russian or North Korean troops losing their lives here. VisualPolitik community, the Kursk offensive was a risky move. A bold move that caught the Kremlin by surprise and went on to capture the attention of the war. And let's see, right now, there's still a huge divide among on military experts as to whether this operation achieved its objectives, or was instead a monumental strategic blunder. For its supporters, the Ukrainian invasion of Russia diverted the focus from other hard-hit fronts, demonstrated that fears of nuclear escalation were exaggerated, boosted national morale, and also potentially gave the Ukrainians an all-important bargaining chip. For its detractors, on the other hand, it meant consuming scarce resources in an operation that had no feasibility of going much further. In any case, what is clear is that this invasion has allowed Ukraine to stabilize other war fronts. Of course, the lack of sufficient arms support in recent months and the total cutoff of assistance decreed by Trump in the last few days have been the final straw for the Ukrainian efforts. And do you know what? 81 years before this latest Ukrainian offensive, in the summer of 1943, the Battle of Kursk took place, the largest tank battle in history and an absolutely key turning point in the course of World War II. Well, now the great concern is that 8 decades later, this battlefield will once again be a turning point. And keep in mind that it's a fear that has prompted Republican Senator Lindsey Graham to call for the immediate restoration of cooperation and assistance with Ukrainian forces.
Until we have a ceasefire, I would give Ukraine what they need in terms of intelligence and weapons to defend themselves. A pause in U.S. help for Ukraine could be worse than Afghanistan.
Remember that he's one of Trump's biggest sycophants, and a guy who went so far as to call for Zelensky's resignation following the clash in the Oval Office. And he did so despite the fact that just a few days earlier in Munich, he had described the Ukrainian president as the ally he's always dreamed of having. But hey, let's just say Graham is known for being two-faced. Be that as it may, he was not the only one. Many pro-Ukraine Republican senators and congressional supporters seem to be saying behind closed doors that it has gone too far, and that the United States cannot take the risk, under any circumstances, that Ukraine's resistance could collapse. Something that seems to be causing Trump himself to possibly backtrack very soon, at least as far as intelligence sharing is concerned. Whatever the case, all this has made us at VisualPolitik ask some obligatory questions. To what extent could Ukraine hold out without extensive US support? What other options does it have? And the most important question of all, what are the consequences of Washington's latest actions, not only for the Ukrainian war, but for the entire global geopolitical landscape? Well, that's exactly what we're going to look at. And we're also going to see how Trump's move may be a very bad investment for the United States. Pay attention to what we're about to tell you as we go on, because clearly geopolitical decisions not only have military consequences, but also economic ones in the long term.
Collapse in Kursk.
Ukraine seems to have made a decision. The intense Russian-North Korean offensive of the last few days has led them to seek the withdrawal from most of Kursk. That is precisely what we've been seeing in the last few hours. And now, after breaking the front, a total retreat could just be around the corner in the not-too-distant future. Logically, the suspension of US military aid does not mean that Ukraine has suddenly run out of ammunition and military equipment, but it has automatically forced them to make radical decisions. For example, it has forced them to further ration their consumption of artillery and ammunition. Because logically, if you're not sure what you're going to get, you'd better not be left with empty arsenals. And remember that until now, the United States accounted for more than half of all foreign supplies that Ukraine received of 155mm artillery shells. That is to say that suddenly the supply, a supply that was already very limited, and it's a very similar story with anti-aircraft defense, with which the Ukrainians will now have to be much more selective in shooting down Russian missiles, which basically means that they'll have to let many more missiles through. And naturally, they'll also have to rationalize the maintenance and spare parts of the equipment they use, which will require them to reduce their intensity of use. So yes, logically, from that point of view, Trump's decision has had immediate effects. Even if the arsenals are not emptied all at once, the conditions of war, and especially the type of war that can be sustained, has changed in the blink of an eye. Even more so when we also take into account that the suspension of intelligence and precision satellite imagery support greatly reduces the efficiency of munitions use. Because yes, Trump's maximum pressure strategy has also meant even this.
U.S. suspends Ukraine's access to satellite imagery. Ukraine uses the technology to track the movement of Russian troops and assess damage to infrastructure.
In other words, Ukraine has suddenly lost the ability to track major frontline movements of Russian troops, as well as its ability to locate its supply lines, fuel depots, and arsenals. And not only that, they've also lost the ability to accurately locate targets at a distance and attack them with precision weapons. Weapons that need an exact location, something that, until now, the Ukrainians achieved with US satellites. A capability they have now lost. In other words, they have become largely blind and lame.
I have never seen anything like this in my almost 35 years of experience. Stopping intelligence support for a political purpose and to try to coerce a partner like Ukraine into acceding to an administration's wishes. Russia is using missiles and weapons from all over the world, from North Korea to Iran, to fire from all directions towards Ukraine. But nevertheless, we have limited Ukraine from using our weapons to return fire.
And that is precisely why the logical decision in the face of Russia's extremely fierce onslaught was to step back, which is exactly what they've done. So now the question is, how far can it resist? Well, according to Donald Trump, the Ukrainians have no more cards. They're finished. He's even stated several times that if things go on like this, they probably have no future as a country. Of course, this is part of that maximum pressure strategy, because the situation is far from being like that. It's certain that without US support, Ukraine will have a very hard time in the short term, something that in Washington's eyes will force them to give in and accept whatever deal they are offered. The question is this really the case? Well, not necessarily. Ukraine still has enough muscle to be stronger in the face of a possible negotiation, as long as some circumstances are met, or rather, as long as the rest of its allies take their new role very seriously at this time. Because if this happens, Putin will, yes, probably still be able to make some progress, but this will most likely be limited. Don't forget that Russia has made a titanic effort over the last year. To date, the only thing that they are clearly ahead in is the manufacture of ammunition, particularly for artillery. And do you know what? That is not only a problem, but also a clear failure of the European countries that have had 3 long years to prepare and change this situation, and yet they've hardly done anything. This cannot be repeated. The good news is that this time, the Europeans may have learned their lesson.
EU chief unveils €800 billion plan to arm Europe.
So then, what exactly is Ukraine's position? Is it as bad as Trump makes it out to be? Well, no, but let's look at it in detail. Well, first, in recent months, Ukraine has managed to stabilize most fronts, and its men have had some breathing space. Not much, but they are probably better off than they were some time ago. Second, their military industry continues to grow thanks to funding from the rest of the allies, something that is allowing them to cover more and more of their war needs. Yes, they are still far from being self-sufficient, but it is estimated that Ukraine's industrial production could already exceed $20 billion annually. And in some fields, such as drones, they are making very rapid progress. In fact, the massive use of drones turns any Russian infantry advance into a real carnage. This is what is known as the new tactical concept of successive lines of drones. In total, it is estimated that Ukraine already manufactures about half of all the weapons it consumes.
It is no longer 2022. Our resistance is greater now. We have the means to defend ourselves.
And third, military support from Europe is likely to increase strongly, both in the coming weeks and particularly in the coming months and years. Following the news of the changing situation in Kursk, Zelensky has confirmed a new package of urgent military support from Poland, another from Germany, another from France, and several more from the Nordic and Baltic countries.
Sweden, Norway, and Baltic countries pledge new aid for Ukraine's war effort.
Now then, okay, I know what many of you are probably thinking, but let's see, Josh. With all that we've seen, yes, the Ukrainians may be able to resist or slow down Russian advances, but they're not going to be able to end the war. So what's the point in all this? Well, something very important. Ukraine knows that a peace agreement where they have to accept all the concessions is not enough, no matter how much the White House is looking for something like that. In Kyiv, they know that if that happens, they will be sold out sooner rather than later. Why? Well, because Moscow would see this and sell it as a crushing victory, and the morale of the Ukrainians would be in tatters. Think about it. What would have been the use of their tenacious resistance? What would have been the use of such a huge effort? That's why Ukraine needs to have strength at the negotiating table, both in regards to Moscow and, very importantly, in regards to Washington. Ukraine also needs to achieve something in the negotiations, to obtain real security guarantees, and to demonstrate to the Europeans themselves that, with their help, Ukraine could become a pillar for the security of the entire continent. Without this, it's possible that no matter what agreement is signed today, war will be a reality again in a very short time. And then they would be facing a Russia with renewed energy, as well as a lot of combat experience. And don't forget what we've already told you in several videos. Russia never honors its agreements. Thus, if Ukraine fails to fully secure its future in these negotiations, then it simply won't have any future. That is something that is very clear to everyone in Kyiv. So the question is, how to achieve this? Well, the most important thing of all is to have an alternative to simply giving in. They cannot give in, no matter how much Donald Trump insists on it. That could be a historic strategic mistake. Now, hold on a minute, because this is not the entire story. With this whole political military mess that Donald Trump has unleashed, one very important question has arisen that may forever change the way we understand international security. VisualPolitik community, I'm talking about the interrelationship with the US military-industrial complex. Let me explain. Donald Trump has suddenly cut off military assistance to an allied country, and he's done so in the pursuit of political objectives of his own. In doing so, he's not only stopped delivering ammunition and equipment, he's also prevented them from accessing new supplies, even if they pay for them. For example, the F-16s, and has cut off their intelligence and military communication systems. And naturally, the point is that this is no longer just about Ukraine. For example, many relatively advanced European weapons rely on US systems to accurately hit enemy targets. Until now, this was seen as something totally normal, but now those days are over. If Washington has done it to Ukraine, couldn't it do it in the future to other allies? Couldn't it blind them, or even, as is being said, block many shipments of advanced equipment such as the F-35? Pay attention to this because it's no joke. Trump's sudden decision has shown United States allies that when the time comes, Washington could block its own weapons to force them to accept whatever conditions Uncle Sam deems appropriate at any given moment. So what does this mean? That continuing to work in this way is real nonsense. And watch out, because we're talking about Europe, but also about South Korea, Japan, and practically any other allied country. They can no longer rely on the technological capabilities of the United States. If they want to protect their security, they have to develop their own combat systems. And this explains news items like this one in the German newspaper Bild.
Fear of Trump's kill switch, F-35. A panic grows. An inside source warns of the possibility of a kill switch, a remote switch to shut down US high-tech aircraft, even in case of war.
And yes, okay, Bild is a pretty sensationalist media outlet, but the truth is that the word is out there, especially after Trump will also cut off assistance to the Ukrainian F-16. And guess what? This could be a major blow to the US military industry, an industry that is selling the world more than $300 billion worth of weapons per year. And yet, now their biggest customers, the European governments, are debating whether or not continuing to buy these weapons makes sense. Isn't it better to have a slightly less capable but autonomous aircraft, rather than slightly superior aircraft controlled by Washington? The answer seems clear, doesn't it? And this applies to any technology that could be considered critical.
Europe races to find Starlink alternatives for Ukraine.
Let's see. Elon Musk has said he won't cut Starlink, no matter what. But whatever, no one trusts him anymore. Several governments and the European Commission are currently working with 4 satellite companies to establish a service that could be a clear alternative to Starlink in the event of a conflict. This is likely to lead to a major strengthening of its capabilities in the coming years. And this, of course, is just one example. France has also just announced that it is ramping up its defense production to full speed. It is preparing to more than double its production of Rafale fighter bombers, guided missiles, anti-tank systems, and drones. And all for what? Well, not only to supply its own demand, but also to supply other European countries. Countries that in the past would probably have bought from the United States, and now will probably opt for much more local production. VisualPolitik community, it's possible that in the coming days, Washington will reverse its position and once again provide support to Ukraine. But keep one thing in mind. Whatever the case, this will be much more limited, and meanwhile, much of Kursk and probably this whole operation is already lost. Ukraine's collapse is not on the table, although US pressure is making a dent. And let's see, this may give the Trump administration some breathing space to move forward with its plans, but strategically and in the long term, these decisions have probably been a huge mistake that will result in a lot of contracts lost for the US military industry, as well as a fundamental distrust towards everything that has to do with Washington. I don't know, but it all has to do with Make America Great Again. VisualPolitik community, the question is, do you think Europe's support will be enough? Will the European governments be able to get their act together in a reasonable time frame? Do you think that despite everything, Ukraine will achieve its goals? Leave us your opinions in the comments. And now, if you found this video interesting, please like it, and don't forget to subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. All the best, I'll see you next time.